I feel like the most alive and the most connected to whoever it is that I really am when I'm out in high and wild places. Or like in the example of sailing out in the wide blue yonder, way out in the ocean. It's a horizontal instead of the vertical, but it's really like the same thing. It's almost like the smaller and more insignificant and more vulnerable that I feel, the more that I feel connected to whatever it is that this whole thing, that we call human existence is really all about. So I think maybe a lot of people try to avoid that feeling where they feel really small and kind of scared, but I love that feeling and I've been seeking it out now for like most of my life.
Welcome back to the 10 Adventures podcast. Today we're talking about some of the world's most remote places with legendary climber, explorer, author, filmmaker Mark Synnott. Mark has summited Everest amongst many other challenging peaks and is about to release Into the Ice, a book on his 7,000-mile voyage through the Arctic Passage, as well as a National Geographic documentary on his trip called Lost in the Arctic. Hi, Mark. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Richard. Thanks for having me. It's an honor.
It's so cool to see you in your boat. I know we're going to talk a little bit about that later, but I want to, kind of talk about how you got to this point. So you're renowned for climbing some of the highest and most challenging mountains on Earth, but you switched gears into sailing. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how you got to this point?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I'll try not to take up the entire interview on this one answer. But yeah, I mean, it started with an expedition that I did in 2005. And it was to a place called Pitcairn Island, which is in the South Pacific. And I read a book that showed these crazy cliffs coming out of the water. And I had been going on all these expeditions to cold, nasty places like mountain ranges, like the Himalaya, the Arctic, that kind of stuff, always freezing my ass off. And I thought, man, you know what? Maybe I should go on an expedition one of these days to somewhere tropical. So I launched this plan to do the first ever climbing expedition to Pitcairn. And as I started working on it, I realized the only way that you can get there is to sail. And Pitcairn is the most remote inhabited landmass on Earth. It's out in the middle of the South Pacific Ocean, and they don't have an airport. There's no ferry service. So we chartered a boat. We sailed there. And on that expedition, while we were sailing, which was really my first time ever sailing, I had what you might call an epiphany, where I just had this moment out on the water at night. I was single-handing the boat when everybody else was asleep. And I looked out at the moon kind of scintillating on the water. And I just thought to myself, this feels exactly like it feels when I'm way out in the mountains. And the thought that followed immediately afterward was, maybe I should be a mariner. Maybe I should get into this and become a sailor. So that was in 2005, and I pretty much never looked back. I didn't stop climbing, but I dug into becoming a sailor in the same way that I dug into becoming a climber when I was a kid, when I was a teenager. And that was 20 years ago, and I've been going nonstop, and here I am now. I'm finally living on my boat. I'm starting to do some crazier expeditions, but I've got all my stuff. I got all my climbing gear. I got my ski stuff. And so it's like a whole thing. It's all molded together in one big crazy adventure.
What I'm interested is a lot of people get a sailboat and they stick in warm waters. A lot of people who climb, they kind of climb the local crags or, mountains nearby. You've always really been about testing yourself and going to remote places to explore. What do you think drives that urge to do something so challenging, so much more challenging than what normal people pursue?
I mean, I think when I was pretty young, Richard, I still got into climbing. I started when I was like 15. I feel like I just kind of realized that like the wilder, the crazier, the higher, the further out, the more remote, the closer that I got to like the real me. It's sort of a hard thing to explain, but I feel like the most alive and the most connected to whoever it is that I really am when I'm out in high and wild places, or, like in the example of sailing, like out in the wide blue yonder, way out in the ocean. It's a horizontal instead of the vertical, but it's really like the same thing. So it's almost like the smaller and more insignificant and more vulnerable that I feel, the more that I feel connected to whatever it is that this whole thing, that we call human existence is really all about. So I think maybe a lot of people try to avoid that feeling where they feel really small and kind of scared, but I love that feeling and I've been seeking it out now for like most of my life.
Wow, that's really beautiful how you state that. And I love to do a lot of backpacking with my family, and I get, I've never thought of it that way, but it's this removal of distractions, and you kind of have to be who you are. You can't, it doesn't matter what you're wearing, what you do. You're just some dude trying to make your way in the backcountry with the people you're with. And I love how you frame that.
Well, yeah, I mean, just to like survive. So you put yourself like way out there
Yeah.
on Northwest Passage or in Everest or up on some first ascent or some giant cliff out in the middle of nowhere. And it does get pretty real. And I mean, I can't think of anything better than that, and I feel like there's so much that we're capable of, and we have so much resilience and just like an ability to scrap, and survive our way through situations that we kind of don't get to see the real dimensions of that unless we make our lives incredibly difficult. And again, it seems like society is set up for avoiding that and making life really easy. But I don't feel like that's kind of like the natural place where we're supposed to be as human beings. And so the harder, the more challenging, the more suffering, the more I learn about myself. And like I said, the closer that I get to the real me.
Wow, that's so deep. Speaking of suffering, part of your book is retracing um, the journey of Sir John Franklin's 1845 expedition, which I could only imagine the suffering. Was almost 200, 180 years ago. Can you talk a little bit about that expedition and what you were looking to find?
Yeah, so the Franklin expedition, and by the way, my book is written for I'm trying to find readers who don't know the Franklin expedition because I think the story is crazier than anything that we could make up. So my ideal reader is someone who comes into it and is hearing these stories for the first time and just hopefully like blown away, like, wow, I cannot believe something like this happened in real life. But in the mid 1840s, Franklin set off. He was a captain in the British Royal Navy on this state-of-the-art expedition to try to be the first to make it through the Northwest Passage. So in other words, to sail from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean through the Arctic up over the top of what is today Canada. Back then, it was all terra incognita. Nobody knew what was out there. The literal blank on the map, and they didn't even really know if it was possible, if there was like a sea route that, you could use to connect those two oceans. But the idea behind it was that it would be a shortcut to get to the Far East. And so for like the British, they could sail, through the Arctic and get to the Far East a lot more quickly than they could by going down around Cape Horn or by going around Cape of Good Hope around the bottom of Africa. And so there was two ships, Erebus and Terror. It was 129 people, and they disappeared and never came back out. No one survived. To this day, it's still a mystery about what really happened to them. A lot of different pieces have been put together, but it's an absolutely wild story, mainly because we do have a lot of testimony from Inuit, and some of it suggests that the crew, or at least some of them, were still alive by like the mid 1850s.
Oh
So
wow.
you're talking 10 years. And so for someone like me who's fascinated by history and by the Arctic and exploration and adventure, the whole idea of like what happened over the course of those 10 years is just so compelling and sort of like, I would say, kind of irresistible to someone like me, like the mystery of it. And it just piques my curiosity in the same way I'm super curious about geography and what's out there in the world and what it's like up on cliffs out in the middle of nowhere and in the middle of the ocean and all that kind of stuff. This is the same kind of thing, really like the same feeling. And it's interesting the way it's all tied up in exploration. That's what the Franklin expedition was doing, and that's what I was trying to do when I kind of followed in the wake of Erebus and Terror, with the idea of seeing if we could find the tomb of John Franklin on a place called King William Island. And it's really a long story. I tell it in a lot of depth in my book. But at the heart of it, it's a mystery about what happened to those guys, and it's sort of about us imagining, like what they must have gone through, and the lengths to which they probably went to in their quest to like survive the whole ordeal.
It was really important for you to retrace the journey in a sailboat and not just, fly to King William Island. Why was that?
The answer to that sort of ties back to what I do for work, which is nowadays I come up with crazy ideas, expeditions, and I go and execute them, and and then I try to do storytelling, kind of like what you're doing with the podcast, So like I've been making documentary films for National Geographic, I've been writing articles, and I've been writing books. And I guess really like where it started was that I decided that if I could do anything in my boat, what I wanted to do was sail to the Arctic. And and then the more I kind of started thinking about that, I was like, instead of just going to the Arctic, why don't I just like go all the way through it and sail all the way west to the Pacific Ocean? Then I could keep going and I could get to like where I am now in Mexico, and then continue sailing west and go out into the South Pacific and just do this big, crazy like voyage of discovery. And so that was sort of like the dream and the vision. But then I kind of zoomed out a bit and I just asked myself, is there some crazy story that I could tell? Could I do like an immersive journalistic kind of thing where I'm not just trying to see if I can do the Northwest Passage, but I'm trying to tell a story. I'm trying to share history that people don't know about while I'm doing it. And so that's kind of how it came together. I've been really lucky to have this long relationship with National Geographic, and it just happens that it's almost like they can't say no when you combine like historical mystery with a modern day crazy adventure. And I have had some good success with pulling these things off. So that's sort of a part of how it came together the way that it did. The other part of it, Richard, is that I am absolutely fascinated by the history of exploration and like what you might call the golden age of discovery, when so much of the world was still unexplored. And I knew that if I went and did this, I would just be immersing myself so deep into that. And then writing about it, I was going to spend literally years of my life going super deep into all that history. I mean, I probably read, 50 books total by this point on the subject. And that's just pure pleasure for me to go so deep into something that I find so interesting.
Yeah, I know what you're saying about the golden age of exploration. I love when I come across an antiquarian bookshop where they still are, and they've got, these long out of print books of expeditions I've never heard of. And, just this idea of terra incognita is just so alluring, and just thinking what it must have been like for, hundreds of explorers to go and just not know what they're going to find, but be willing to put their lives on the line.
Yeah. Imagine a day when we didn't have Google Earth, when we didn't even have maps, and what that must have been like. I think about that constantly now. I'm living on my boat, I'm sailing, I'm looking at charts. I'm like, imagine what it was for the first people who came here and they had no idea. There were no soundings on the chart. They didn't know if there were rocks. I mean, think about how good they must have been, at the whole thing. the whole game of being explorers and mariners. And so, yeah, it puts things in perspective and it motivates me to make sure that I'm challenging myself. And truthfully, I deeply like regret that I wasn't born sooner when I could have been, exploring at a time where like so much of the world was unknown. I did feel at a certain point, like as a younger person, that I had very much missed out on the golden age of exploration. But the deeper that I've got into it, the more I've done, the more I've realized it really is still alive and well. It's different, but there's still plenty of frontiers out there. And I mean, I can't think of anything better than trying to figure out where they are and exploring them.
Now, who joined you on this trip?
Well, so all told, the entire expedition was 4 months, and during that time, we had a total of, I think there were 12 different people who took part in the expedition. We had some people who came in the beginning. We had some guys that sailed with us from Maine to Newfoundland to Greenland. Then we kind of switched things up. We had a slightly different crew for the overland expedition that we did on King William Island, where we went out on four-wheelers. We did a 500-mile search, kind of like off-road, looking for Franklin's tomb. One of the key people, well, I had my first mate, who's a guy named Ben Zartman. He's an old friend of mine from Yosemite. We used to live in adjacent caves from each other. And so he was the only person that did the entire expedition with me from start to finish. Everybody else kind of came and went. The other really key person was a guy named Renan Ozturk. And Renan and I have done a lot of expeditions together. He's a renowned climber. He climbed Meru with Jimmy Chin and Conrad Anker. I think it was in 2011 when they finally made it up it. And he's been a fellow teammate of mine on the North Face athlete team. But Renan is also a renowned filmmaker and photographer. So he's the one who came along and he documented the whole thing, which was really crazy, challenging thing for him to do because I made him agree that he would be like a fully functioning member of the crew. So like, you're going to have to take watch. You're going to have to help me with sails. You're going to have to help with piloting the boat, like all that kind of stuff. And you're going to make a documentary film and shoot photos for National Geographic magazine. And Renan is an incredibly capable person, perhaps more so than anyone that I know. So like he signed up for it. But what that added up to was, I think, him going for like months without actually sleeping and just literally like running himself ragged. But he did it, and you saw the film, and
Beautiful.
he just absolutely killed it, as far as capturing, not just like getting the imagery and all that, but capturing the essence of what it was really like for us to be up there, and doing it in a way where it sort of feels like art more so than just like video.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I mentioned before we started the episode, just my kids were transfixed. My wife loved it. She's like, "Where can we watch more of these?" And so I think anytime you can have an informational, real life film that captures a whole family, like those aren't common, and it's just a beautifully shot film. And one thing that I thought that had the kids on the edge of their seats was in the 87 days it took you to get to Goa Haven. You spent a week or maybe a bit more trapped in, I think it's called Paisley Bay, where you got caught in by sea ice. Can you talk a little bit about that and, maybe some of the other hazards of sailing in the Arctic?
Well, so the very first thing that you're going to think about if you want to go sail through the Northwest Passage is, what kind of boat do you have? And it's sort of been known for a long time that the ideal hull for your boat would be made out of steel. And the idea there is if you got caught in the ice, a steel hull is so much stronger than like fiberglass or aluminum that it might be able to withstand like chunks of ice coming in and crushing against the side of the boat. But there's also a saying, which is the best boat is the one that you have. And my boat is this boat. Polar Sun is got a fiberglass hull. So basically this boat's made out of plastic. It's not ideal for sailing in the Arctic. But I spent about 6 months kind of sizing it up and just deciding, like, would it be prudent for me to go into the Arctic in this boat? I checked in with a lot of people, a lot of experts, finally decided, you know what? Like, it's not like beyond the pale to do something like that. It's okay. We decided to go for it, but then, there was always this consideration, like, make sure no matter what that we don't get caught in the ice. And, I'm sure people wonder. I mean, one thing I learned about doing this trip is a lot of people don't even know what the Northwest Passage is. When I came back from the trip and I mentioned it to people, and they were like, kind of like shaking their head, like they weren't really sure where that was. Some people who do know about it are kind of wondering, wow, is there even ice up there anymore? Well, it's way less than it was than Franklin went through, but there's still a crazy amount of ice in the Arctic, which is good, of course. And in some ways, like with the melting that we are experiencing, it's almost making it worse because it's opening up these channels that are leading south from the like polar ice cap, and spots that used to be plugged with ice that would prevent ice from getting pushed down into the Northwest Passage are now open. So you have these huge sheets of like roving pack ice. They can be 20, 30, 50, hundreds of miles across with floating chunks of all different sizes that are like 6 feet thick. Your job as a mariner going through the Northwest Passage is to avoid that stuff. I would say that we endeavored to the absolute best of our ability to avoid the ice, and we still failed. And we got caught in Pasley Bay. And yeah, you saw the footage of that, and it was, it was harrowing. Like, we came really, really close to losing the boat. I mean, I don't think any of us were particularly worried about the fact that we would die, because we were in a bay. So, like, worst case scenario, it was like the boat's going to get crushed and it's going to sink, or more likely, the ice will push it up onto the land. But if that happened to you when you were out in the open ocean where you have swell and big waves and the ice chunks crashing against each other, then that's like a really scary thing, because then the boat could sink in the ice and you don't have anywhere to go. You can't get out onto a life raft because you're on heaving plates of ice, and you would have nowhere to go. At the time, it was the most stressful, intense thing that I think I've ever experienced in a lifetime of going on expeditions and, trying to make my life difficult. And I severely regretted some of the decision making that led up to us ending up in that position. But now that I'm out of it and I'm here and we have these stories that we're telling, I have the film and the book and everything, I look back and I'm like, man, this story would not even be nearly as good as if that hadn't happened. So I guess I feel like, in a way, that it was kind of a blessing that we got caught on the ice and that we managed to squeak our way out of it. Because here I am. Obviously, I'm in Polar Sun. It's still in one piece. I'm in Mexico. We're still going. If I don't see any ice again in the ocean, like, I'll be pretty okay with that.
Once you got to King William Island, you mentioned you had a 500-mile exploration on quads. For people who live in, regular climes, that seems kind of challenging. But being in the Arctic, it was incredibly challenging. Can you talk a little bit about what it's like to explore an Arctic island?
A lot of people probably don't realize is that the whole central Arctic is Midwestern. It's totally flat. I mean, King William Island, the highest elevation is 300 feet, and that's one little hill, but most of it is like 30 feet above sea level maximum. And if you looked on a map of King William Island, you would see thousands of tiny little lakes, ponds, little streams interconnecting it. And then in between all that water, you have like these gravel plains. They call it shingle. It's like little broken up pieces of limestone. And then you have these bogs. And the bogs are basically, yeah, they're like mud bogs. um, grassy quagmires, and um, and so yeah, that's what's made it so challenging. I mean, there's no roads or anything like that, so you're just, you know, off-road, four-wheeling, constantly trying to pick your way through all these little lakes. We had to cross tons and tons of streams, and we had the bikes like constantly getting buried in the mud and having to pull each other out, getting flat tires, driving over all these crazy rocks, and all out on this like incredibly homogeneous plain. I mean, I'm making it sound like it's varied, in terms of the environment, and it is, but the entire thing is pancake flat. And so it's kind of bizarre. It's a bizarre landscape. It's incredibly vast. You're talking thousands and thousands of square miles out in the whole central Arctic. And that's where, Franklin and his men were lost, and where they eventually had to abandon the ships, and they went out on foot, and they were dragging smaller boats with them, hoping that they could get to open water and try to sail or work their way down into the interior of Canada and in these rivers. And so that's what we were thinking about when we were out there, like just looking at it and thinking, like, imagine being out here on foot, 180 years ago without enough food, suffering from scurvy. I mean, they must have had trench foot and were walking through the mud and all kinds of stuff like that.
One thing that's interesting is people are still searching for Franklin 175 years after the journey. And you mentioned there's a lot of folklore from the local Inuit. And even that, early people trying to find out what happened, they never even thought to ask the local Inuit. Can you tell a little bit more about how Franklin fits into local mythology of the Inuit?
So yeah, we have the Franklin mystery, the Franklin expedition mystery, if we want to call it that. And there's kind of like what you might call the standard reconstruction about what we think might have happened. A lot of that reconstruction was put together a very long time ago by British expeditions that went out in search of Franklin. There were like dozens of them. Um, and we're still looking for Franklin and to try to find out what happened. One of the things that you'll hear in the standard reconstruction is that the Franklin expedition was last seen off the coast of Greenland on July, whatever it was, 12th of 1845. But that's actually totally wrong, because the Franklin expedition, according to Inuit lore and testimony, had a lot of interaction with the local people. And on King William Island, on the Adelaide Peninsula, potentially on the Melville Peninsula. And we're lucky that an American explorer named Charles Francis Hall kind of figured out after the Civil War that the Inuit had these stories, and he went up and he recorded hours and hours and days and weeks of Inuit testimony, and it paints a totally different picture of what happened to Franklin and his men than what we kind of were always told by this, standard European construction. And there was a lot of interaction, and a lot of stories, they just don't fit, with this standard story about what happened. One of those stories talks about an important man, kind of like a chief of the expedition, being brought ashore and buried in like a tomb of some sort. And then there being like like what sounds like a 21 gun salute. And a lot of people believe that person was Franklin, and that he was buried ashore by his crew in a tomb, and that some of his papers, if not his logbook, were buried with him. And the Inuit talk about how there were papers and there were books that were buried with him. And so the idea is that if you could find Franklin's tomb, you might find his logbooks. And the Inuit say it's there and that it exists. And there are actually a lot of different testimony that points to it. And so that's kind of what our expedition was all about. We um, sort of had the idea, like, what if we took all the European knowledge of this mystery and we set it aside and we just listened to what the Inuit say? Where would that lead us? And it led us to this very specific place on King William Island, where we thought Franklin's tomb might be. All of that part of the expedition was led by a amateur Franklin historian named Tom Gross. And I found Tom early on in this process. When I found him in 2021, 2022, he was, I think, 28 years into searching for Franklin's tomb. And the wild thing about it is that during an aerial reconnaissance in 2015, he saw what he believes was the tomb up on the north side of King William Island. And anyways, that's sort of what our expedition was all about, was trying to find it.
So I'm not going to give away this suspenseful part of the book, but let's talk about after you'd finished the search. What was the rest of the journey like to Nome, Alaska?
Well, the interesting thing is that, the way that National Geographic kind of envisioned it, from their perspective. So the film, like, the trip ends at the end of the overland expedition. But as it turns out, you're still only halfway through the Northwest Passage. So, like, the story that kind of everybody has heard so far, the magazine article and the documentary on National Geographic, it only gets us halfway. So from there, it was still, I think, 2,300 miles. So that's the equivalent of doing a transatlantic. And a good chunk of that is across the North Slope of Alaska. And, unless you're Alaskan, I don't think a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about the North Slope of Alaska, like where that is, what it looks like. It is the biggest, most vast expanse of like just remote wilderness that I have ever seen. I mean, from the point where you sort of emerge from what they call the Northwest Passage, so you're in this like archipelago of all the islands, and then you come out of that and you're in what's called the Beaufort Sea, which is basically the Arctic Ocean. And now you have the North Slope of Alaska, and then you have the polar ice cap to the north of there. And there's this little strip of open water in between the ice cap and Alaska. That section there is like about 1,200 miles alone. And the wild thing about it is it's all shoal. So it's very shallow, and there's no harbors. It's just this flat expanse, of tundra, and there's nowhere to hide. There's no harbors that you can go into. And if you go through the Northwest Passage from east to west like we did, there's really no way not to get there at the end of the season. And what happens in that part of the world, once you start getting into autumn, you get like past a certain point in September, and you get in like what they call the autumn like storm season. And then you start getting these low pressure systems that come out of the North Pacific, and they just pump up into the Arctic. And it can turn into a situation where it's just like one after another, and they're just following each other with no breaks in between. And then you can get these superstorms where they kind of like combine and turn into like a perfect storm type situation. All of this is occurring while you're in a place where you have nowhere to hide. So it's really kind of wild and exposed, and that's all part of the story that that didn't make it, into the National Geographic special. And it really was, kind of epic, and I would say probably like the most daunting thing that I've ever done, easily like on par with getting caught in the ice in Pasley Bay.
One aspect of sailing is, you have these beautiful views and you're going to these remote places, but you're also stuck in a pretty small space with other people. Can you talk about some of the challenges of sharing a boat with, in a small space, especially with these extreme weather events that you have to deal with? Like these are stressful situations, and you can't just leave the boat and go get a coffee or go get dinner and come back relax. You're stuck on there together. What's that like?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sitting in the cabin of Polar Sun right now. I mean, she's 47 feet, so that's like pretty decent size for a boat, but this main salon here is like the size of like a storage unit. And yeah, in like the heart of the Northwest Passage, we had five of us, five guys. We were living in this tiny cabin. If you want to go over there, if you want to get a drink and someone's there, you have to like coordinate. This person has to come out of this little passage, then you go in, or you go this way, they go that way. You're constantly doing that. There's no privacy. And then you add on top of that, you're cold, tired, hungry, scared, stressed out. That has a tendency to bring out the worst in people's personalities. And I've dealt with it before. I've done a lot of climbing. Been stuck in tents. I climbed big walls where I was stuck in portaledges on the side of the cliff for long periods of time. I feel like I'm pretty good with dealing with like all those kind of ups and downs and like diffusing situations. But we had quite a bit of tension that developed here on Polar Sun. I mean, maybe a lot of it was in my own mind, but the thing is with that stuff is that if you are feeling it or you think you're feeling it, then it's real and it matters. And so not only were we dealing with like a really intense and challenging situation, but we were doing it, at a time when like the tension was so thick here in aboard Polar Sun that you felt like you could cut it with a knife. And it didn't feel good. It made it so that at a certain point, like at least for me personally, I felt like I didn't even really want to be doing it anymore because I wasn't enjoying the experience. And that's the thing about interpersonal dynamics, like all this adventure and exploration stuff is as far as I'm concerned, it's just like the best way, that I could possibly spend my time here on Earth. But add in some bad blood between your teammates, and all of a sudden it's just not fun at all anymore. And that's part of the story. I had to decide when I sat down to write the book, like, am I gonna tell the story warts and all, or will I just kind of gloss over that part and pretend it didn't happen? I know you've read a lot of, history of exploration and mountaineering and that kind of thing. So you probably know that there's a tradition, in that genre to like homogenize everything and to just sort of tell the heroic tale of conquest and really not go too deep into the interpersonal dynamics. And we know that there's tons of that stuff that has been going on for as long as people have been doing intense adventures like these. But for the most part, the history of mountaineering and exploration literature really it glosses over all that. I kind of decided that I would be doing a disservice to my readers if I didn't just tell it like it is, warts and all. So that's what I did. I went through my first draft. I made it as edgy and real as I possibly could. Then I read it. I had some other people read it and was like, ooh, I don't know, man. This is a little too much. So then I went back. I did some homogenizing and some smoothing over, but I think in the end I ended up with a story that's pretty true to how it went for us out there. And I hope that people will appreciate that. And I have heard from some early readers that that it was one of the more interesting elements of the book and of the story of what we experienced.
Yeah, it's a page turner, and there's just so much going on. You've got, Franklin's expedition, your expedition, the issues of just sailing in the Northwest Passage, the interpersonal issues, which make it, there's just a lot going on, which is interesting. And yeah, I always like it when books that have, knowledge and information in a story when you can't put it down, I think that's the best sign of a book, that people end up consuming it over 2 or 3 nights because they just want to see how the whole thing fits together.
Well, that's awesome to hear. That's the goal, when you're setting out. And yeah, I hope people can see when they read it, like, wow, like there's a lot of different threads here. Like, that must have been pretty hard to kind of weave this all together in a coherent way where you feel like you're kind of flowing from one story to the next. That's why I was saying that my ideal reader is probably someone who doesn't know the Franklin expedition, because then when the history is new, I feel like that, track of the story will be really compelling for people who are very familiar with Arctic history. Maybe that part is going to be less compelling, but if you're reading that part and you're like feeling anxious, oh, like I want to go back to like what's going on with Mark and Ben, like it seems like a freaking pressure cooker and someone's going to blow a circuit, like that's good. If you're feeling like, this is bogging down, I'm anxious to get into the next part of the story, that's okay. But yeah, I do really hope that it carries people along, and that, ultimately, like, that nobody notices, you know, the way all the different threads are woven together, because it just sort of happens in an organic way and feels kind of natural and carries you along. I recently just read the final book, because it's finally out, like the hardcover, and I had been away from it for a long time. And I usually do that where I'll read it one last time and I try to like zoom out and be like, I'm not the one who wrote this. Like, where are we at with the story? How's it feel on the page? And I had a good time with it, and I hope that other people do too.
I'm sure they will. Now, even with all the stress of your trip, you didn't give up. You're continuing on. Can you tell me a little bit about what's happened since Nome, and where this voyage continues?
Yeah, so you and I are talking April 2025. It's crazy. The expedition ended in September of 2022. I hauled the boat out in Nome, Alaska. Nome is just south of the Bering Strait. It's not really like a place where people would store their yacht. So she had a pretty rough winter there, but we got her back into the water the next summer. So summer 2023, I sailed Polar Sun with some other folks from Nome to near Juneau, Alaska, to a place called Elfin Cove. Left the boat in the water, actually, on a dock there for another winter. She had a caretaker. And then that gets us through to 2024. And then in June of 2024, so about 9 months ago, I left home in New Hampshire, where I lived with my family and my wife, Hampton, and my son, Tommy, who's 9. We moved aboard, and we've been living aboard ever since. And during that time, we have sailed from up near Juneau, Alaska, down to where we are now, which is a place called Barra de Navidad in Mexico. I have 3 older children who are 26, 23, and 19. They're kind of grown up. They're coming in and out and visiting, but they're not with us, like living with us on the boat. But the voyage is now ongoing. We're hoping to live aboard for a couple more years. And let's see, in 11 days, we have a plan to push off from here and to sail west out into the Pacific Ocean to a place called the Marquesas Islands in French Polynesia. And that's going to be another big adventure, because it's 3,300 miles of open ocean. So we're going to be out at sea for 3 to 4 weeks. And as soon as I stop talking to you, I'm going back into boat repair and maintenance and all that kind of stuff. Right before you and I started talking, I had a mechanic aboard. We've got a problem with the generator. I cannot get it figured out. He couldn't figure it out. So I got to figure out what's going on with that. I got to tighten up a fitting on the boom vang. We got to do provisioning and all kinds of stuff. But it's all good stuff, dude. And it's all tied up with this thing that, that we've been talking about, which is adventure, exploration, executing, big grand plans that get you out into wild places. And in this case now, finally for me, having done all these expeditions, doing it with my family. which is on the one hand awesome, but also I'd say probably the most daunting thing that I've ever done. I mean, I wake up every morning kind of worried, like, how's it going to go for them? Like, how's everybody doing? How are people feeling? Like, what's it going to be like for a 9-year-old to be out at sea for a month? Like, is he going to go crazy? But, I wouldn't want to be anywhere else, and I don't want this whole deal to end. I like at this point, I really don't want to go back home. I just want to keep going for forever.
What's the difference with, kind of your relationship with your family if you think back to all of you living in New Hampshire versus having spent 9 months together on a boat? Like, it must have just totally changed, like deepened the relationship and just the bonds, just spending all this time together.
They're definitely that. There's a lot of positives, but there's also the part that we were talking about before about like the pressure cooker and just like living in a very small space with other people, even if they're your family members and you love them dearly. It's stressful, and I guess we're all kind of guilty of curating our lives a little bit. I think about like the stuff that I post on social media and like people looking in from the outside and they see us hanging out on these beaches and palm trees and things like that. But like the truth of it is like it's a challenging life living on a boat and being in a small space with your family. The other thing is like when you're underway, there's a lot of motion on the boat and it can be kind of never ending and there's no off switch. There's no, you don't really get out of it. So we've been taking some breaks. We've been going and doing stuff on land. We just went to Mexico City. We went to the Yucatan. Once we leave here and we head out into the South Pacific, there's not as many marinas and that kind of thing, and we'll be able to like go into shore, but we'll be like living on the boat at anchor for a very long time. So I think it's going to be very intense, but it's counterbalanced by the fact that we're going to places that we've never been. So everywhere we go is going to be new to us. So that's sort of like, the definition of adventure, just in that it's total unknown, how it's going to go. I wouldn't say that it's going perfectly for us, but we're doing it and we're still together and we're still relatively happy with each other. We have to have some check-ins about things and, we have to work at it to make sure that, things don't go off the rails. I mean, one thing that I've learned from doing this is that it's probably not for everyone. There's, I think, a lot of people who would not enjoy what we're doing. But at the same time, there's this whole world of people who are doing this. And there's a community. We just spent, a few weeks in this anchorage where it's almost like a little village of people living on their boats. And there's a lot of nomadic people who do this stuff. And, when you spend time with them, you just instantly realize like, oh, like we share a kindred spirit with these people, like people who do this kind of stuff. They all tend to be pretty adventurous, I guess, is a good way of putting it. And so, yeah, and and it's totally different. Like at home, we would just like kind of hang out at our house on a boat. People come by every day. They just come to the boat. They come ashore. They come up in their dinghy. They come up. You're like, oh, I was going to do such and such. Actually, I'm going to sit and talk to this guy about boat stuff for like 3 hours. And it's all just awesome. There's a whole crazy story there that somebody needs to tell. I don't know if it'll be me. Right now, I'm just trying to live it and absorb it and just be part of it, and not worry about the storytelling part so much, apart from like sharing some stuff with you.
Mark, it's been so interesting hearing about this journey. I want to maybe just zoom back and, looking at your life. What do you think you've learned?
I feel like one of the things, like maybe like an essential takeaway from all of this is that probably the single most important thing in life is to just pursue your passions. And I think as a parent, that's a really important thing to model for your kids. I mean, I kind of figured out when I was a youth that I was going to spend most of my life doing whatever it is that I had as a career for work. I mean, that's where most of my time was going to be spent. And I grew up in a family where my dad was a banker, my mom was a realtor. I spent many hours as a kid listening to them talk about their work and basically like how much they didn't like it. And my dad in particular was talking about how he just had to like pay his dues so that he could retire when he was 65. But then he also would talk about how he was going to die when he was 80, which he did. So it was like all about these 15 years that were going to be like the payout for all this hard work during life. And I just kind of decided, you know what? That really doesn't add up for me. So I kind of want to do all the cool stuff early on and not wait until I'm old. And now I'm 55. I could tell what it'll be like when I'm 65. I'm like already like pretty crusty and feeling a little wore out, maybe from all the adventures. But for me personally, I was super lucky because I found my passion at an early age, and that's basically adventure, is climbing, skiing, sailing, caving, like trekking, backpacking, like all that. Um, and I feel so lucky that I found that because I know that not everyone knows exactly what their passions are. And then I just worked on trying to get my vocation to line up and be on a parallel track with what I love to do. And I feel so lucky that I was able to find that and to put it together. I never even really had the plan. It just sort of happened randomly. But if you can spend a majority of your time doing things that you love, then you're probably going to be a happy person. If you spend a lot of time doing things that you don't enjoy, you're probably going to be unhappy. So you find what your passions are, and then you try to get your life lined up on these parallel tracks where you're spending a lot of time doing stuff that gives you joy. And I mean, one thing that I've learned, I have 4 children, is that what what I'm passionate about isn't necessarily what they are passionate about. And I think it's really important as a parent to understand that and to realize that it could be anything. For me, it's adventure, but for them, it could be foreign language, it could be science, it could be music, it could be art, it could be some random sport that I don't know anything about. It could be chess. Whatever it is, if you care about it deeply, it's that care, that deep level of care and passion that is going to give orientation and meaning to your life. And searching to try to find like intrinsic meaning can be very challenging. So I think for me personally, the best thing is to just make make it up for yourself. Um, and so far, that has been going pretty well for me. But I don't know how it's gonna like what's gonna happen if I get to a point where I can't go on crazy adventures. I think at that point, I would just try to do it like intellectually and gain knowledge and read and learn about things that I don't know about, which I try to do anyway. But I do really love like putting myself out in the world and going out into geography and doing physical stuff and kind of being out there and seeing things that I've never seen before. And that's kind of like what this current voyage is all about.
What a beautiful way to end this podcast and a great message. Thanks for coming on the show today, Mark.
Hey, thanks for having me, Richard, and for finding me and being willing to do this and hear some of these stories. It was really enjoyable speaking with you.
If people want to find out more about you, follow you on social media, pick up the book, where can they find all this?
Well, the book, it's called Into the Ice, The Northwest Passage, The Polar Sun, and a 175-year-old mystery. It comes out on April 15th. I put my heart and soul into that story, so I want to share it with people. So I do want people to read it. You can get the book anywhere where you buy books, wherever that might be. I am on Instagram where I'm sharing some stuff about this current voyage and kind of like all the stuff that I do. So people should be able to find me on there. It's just M_Synnott. I have a website, which is just my name, marksynnott.com. So yeah, I appreciate people following along, and the best way you could support me and keep me adventuring is just to read my work and check out my upcoming book.
And yeah, that book feels like just a great Father's Day or Mother's Day book for someone that loves history, loves the outdoors, loves incredible journeys. It just feels like that's it's a no-brainer if you're looking for something to do. So head down to your local bookstore and, support the local chain, get a great gift that someone's going to love. I'm going to put links to all this in the show notes so you can find it directly. And thanks everyone for listening to this episode of the 10 Adventures podcast. We'll be back next week to explore the world. Bye-bye.
Start planning your own adventure by visiting us at 10adventures.com and listen to other episodes of the 10 Adventures podcast on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you find your podcasts.